Hello students and welcome to this class. This is the first lecture belonging to the experiences of the color purple, shortened ECP-1. And during today's lecture we will be introducing ourselves to postcolonial theory. This is a recording of the class itself, which means that we will only cover parts of the lesson. However, if you are interested in also participating in the activities, in this case it will particularly be the introduction activity and the exercise after the lecture, you can always find all of my lessons and all of the activities on my webpage feke.online. Today we will be talking about what we consider fine and not, to create a connection to the topic of colonialism and postcolonialism, and then the exercise that comes after that, part C, will cover application of the theory on some examples. Let's begin, shall we? So this is the introduction activity, and what will happen here is that I'll tell you what it's all about, but I will then quickly move throughout the activity itself. For any viewers out there, this might help you to create a sense of connection between what you see in your everyday life and what you think in your everyday life, connected to the ideas then that we will cover afterward. But given that, I'm going to quite quickly skip over the parts of the activity since it was meant to be done during class. This activity is called This is Fine, and we did this for 5 to 10 minutes. And what happened is that we created a range on the floor in the classroom between what would be then fine, and on the other side is this is not fine. And the statements we will show you are meant to be reacted to. And these statements are meant to be provocative. They're not necessarily something that we are standing up with, something we believe in. Some of them might, some of them aren't. It's perfectly fine to think differently in this case. This is to get ourselves warmed up and to get ourselves into the ideas of what we'll cover here. And what the students did were, and what you're meant to do now, but maybe now as you listen to this, it's more like a mental a task instead, is to quickly react to these statements and to take a position within the classroom, right? And then once you've taken that position, I'm going to ask you to motivate why you stand where you do. And these are the two images we're using. So on the one hand, it's going to be fine, on the other one, it's not going to be fine. So I'm going to cover these quickly. Fine or this is not fine. Men holding hands and showing their emotions openly. Calling someone bitch, biatch, or boss bitch. It's more acceptable for people of color to use racial stereotypes. Older women dating a younger partner. Someone who is behaving like a Karen should be told that they are, in fact, a Karen. A man that has sex with many is considered to be a champion, while a woman who has sex with many is considered loose. Or the proverb, a key that has the ability to open many locks is a master key. A lock that can be opened with any key is useless. If you are dressed sluttily, you're asking for it. And it is okay to read your partner's text messages. Right, now we'll carry on to part B, the actual lecture of this class, the history of colonialism and postcolonialism. As always, please take notes. This is a great way for you to keep track of your ideas that I covered during the lecture. And if you have any questions or if there's anything you feel is unclear, please contact me either via Teams or you can always use the question box on my website. Before we learn something new, however, we do need to consider some essential questions. What are our new goals? We might already know quite a lot about this. What kind of activities are we going to do? And what kind of material and knowledge do I need to have to be able to achieve this goal? what eventual problems might occur, and how do I know that I've actually reached the goal itself? I'm now going to try to address these questions by looking at some of the learning goals and the schedule and so on. The schedule itself looks like this, and as always in my classes, we divide the overall learning goals into 12 lessons. You can see here that we're at the very top right now, so ECP-1, the introduction lecture, and then the second class, you are going to be introduced to the color purple, and when you've been introduced to it, you will then start reading it together with myself and the other teachers. The idea here is that we'll read most of the book together in class together, so we'll be able to address any questions and also to discuss the contents. The third lesson will be a short test related to the theory that I teach you today, and then we carry on reading. We will then, during the fourth lesson, have a grammar lecture relating to linking words. We will carry on reading, and here you see it says discussion, plot, and characters. So this is one of the bigger discussion sessions that we'll have throughout this part of the course. The reason for this is that when we read, we might sometimes feel the need to stop and ask questions, but here we're going to be working more deeply with specifically the plot and the characters. We follow up with a short reading linking word test relating to grammar. We carry on reading, and then we finish the book together by the seventh lesson. Once done, we will once again practice discussing and writing, and in this case it will be related to the theory and to the themes of the book. We do that once again the following lesson, and then we improve it even further by adding postcolonial theory and also a personal connection. You will see in just a minute that this is something that you will be asked to do during the final test as well. Then, during ECP-9, we are going to test our reading skills by taking an old English 7 reading test. The purpose of this is to check your reading skills and your reading comprehension in a more formal way, apart from just reading the book. During the 10th lesson, we will prepare ourselves for the essay. You will be able to hand in a cheat sheet. I will show you that in just a minute, that you will be able to use when you actually take the essay or take the essay test during ECP-11. And then the 12th lesson, we'll sit down and give each other some feedback. So that's the overall schedule. And as a student, what kind of material is needed are mainly these things right here. You will need to have the color purple. You will be able to borrow that from the library. You can lend it from the librarians over there. They are very much well aware of what's happening in our class. You can also read more about postcolonial theory on my website. So if you go to the experiences of the color purple, there is a chapter called Postcolonial Theory. Also, you have these templates on the right side that you will be using as you practice reading and writing. In the back, you see a purple sheet. That is the one you will bring with you to the essay itself. And you can see that it covers the colonial theory and the characters and the linking words and the personal connections. So you'll be able to write and fill this sheet with information that you bring with you to the test itself. And then you have an example of one of those writing exercises on the right side where it says describe the character, where we will together help out to create a text that you will receive feedback on to improve even further when writing. And a successful student who will have been going through all of these 12 lessons will be able to do 4 things. The first thing is that the successful student will be able to read and to describe the characters and the events from the color purple. But the student will also be able to describe postcolonial theory. Secondly, the student will be able to compare examples from the color purple with postcolonial theory. Thirdly, that student will eventually be able to sit down and write with varied and precise and correct vocabulary. This comes both to the way you use them, but also to the correct spelling. And furthermore, this also applies to grammar. We want you to have a correct use of grammar in this case, and that's why we're going to continuously practice writing. And then you see it says, and structure using linking words. And this one is a little bit special here. So I'm going to teach you about linking words in 3 lessons, but this is something that I will be looking for. And lastly, we want you to be able to connect all of these ideas with a personal connection. So you look at the color purple, you look at the colonial theory, and you say, what do I think about this? Can I relate this in some way to my life? So essentially, read and describe, compare, express these in writing, and then to discuss it with something relating to your own life. These are the 4 things that I will be looking for when you have written your essay. Before we go into the meat of the lecture, I'm going to cover some key vocabulary that will show up as I talk. And these are the ones you see on the left, and we have the definitions in the middle of the page. Colonialism is the political control over another country, for example, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it. A settler, then, is a person who moves with a group of others to live in a new country or an area. There are settler countries where these settlers or the colonists live together with native people. We have many such examples. For example, we have Australia, Canada, United States. We then also have non-settler countries. It's the cases where there weren't many colonists that lived together with the native people. We have such as Hong Kong, we have India, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Jamaica, and so on. And the driving force behind this is a policy known as imperialism. And the idea of imperialism is to extend a country's power and influence, and you use colonization to achieve this, usually through, for example, military force, a ways of taking over others and using them for their own benefit. Right, so these are some of the ideas that will show up then. And let's talk a little bit about why we study these ideas. And the reason is that colonization has shaped our world and also the way that we understand global history. And particularly, this is why we look at these actions that come from the colonial powers, as they're called. Mostly then, in this case, it will be larger countries that have a imperial policy behind them that actively took other parts of the world for their own. And in this case, this is something that it really hasn't happened in a friendly manner. This has been quite the bloody history. And we will see some examples where it's been less bloody and some examples where it's been brutal, to be honest. And this is something that's happened throughout the entirety of human history. And what we are going to be specifically interested in are the long-term effects. That's why we talk about what's called the post-colonial. So post means after. So this is after colonialism in this case. And there are a lot of things related to post-colonialism. It could be such as the way that people have changed, their lives have changed. It could have been the way that people were treated, people put against one another. It could also be the cultures that were clashing and the way cultures have changed because of this. Politics and, well, essentially there's a lot of topics that influence one another. And in contrast to colonization, which is the historical event, the action itself, we are going to focus on the effects. Here is an example of what would be a non-settler case of colonization. And I want to show you a few of these to give you an idea that it's actually happened all around the world. This is something that it isn't something that just happened in one place. So here we have a trading route known as the Silk Road. This is argued to be one of the most ancient trading roads in the world, and this one ranges all the way from the east parts of China to the Mediterranean Sea in Europe. And we can see here that it covers vast spaces. It goes all the way, crossing many, many countries and various cultures. And the reason why this is interesting for us to look at is because the Silk Road enabled for people to share ideas, for people to share philosophy, religion. They traded in goods, they traded in clothes, and essentially people that perhaps in the past didn't have exceedingly much contact with one another, they were now able to see other parts of the world through trade. And in this case, well, of course, in some cases there were, slavery and so on in ancient history, but in general here, these people moved back and forth, so they weren't settlers. They didn't settle in particular places unless they wanted to create like a trading post. But this is a case where people moved back and forth and they didn't really settle, but they did have influence over one another. That's why, for example, ideas such as Islam, for example, can be found all the way in Uzbekistan, which is in Central Asia, where it's otherwise usually found in the Middle East because people traded back and forth. Here's another case of a non-settler country. We have Hong Kong, that was colonized by Britain, and the colonizers didn't specifically stay there together with them. And Hong Kong is I'm not going to go too political here personally, but it's not looking good at the moment. There's a lot of riots there. People are oppressed, and as you can probably know, we have the Free Hong Kong movement because of this. And then we have examples where we have settling situations where the settlers lived together with the colonized people. Here we have a depiction of the Southern Americas, and we have the war that was waged by the conquistadors and the Christians that arrived, and the massacre of indigenous people in Southern Americas, where eventually these people lived and stayed together with them. And the same thing also happened to the Northern Americas, where we here have the depiction of the way that Native Americans were forced to move across the continent to live in special areas where they were, well, essentially allowed to live, and they were tolerated to live by the colonizers. The picture itself is known as the Trail of Tears, that they were, well, there's a trail, a large road of their suffering, essentially. So we have these cases of where people wanted to expand their power, in cases where we have the Silk Road, where it was trading mostly, and then we have these other situations where people actively went there to take someone else's land. And I'm now going to show you a world map as we knew it around 200 years ago. And I find this map to be incredibly interesting. It is due to the fact that we have very little idea now these days of what exactly parts of the world looked like back then. And we can immediately see there are many places of the world where there are these huge blank white spots. These do not indicate that people didn't live there. It indicates that it was not cut up in terms of mapping. And we can see this relating to Australia, the entire continent of Australia. We can see many parts of Africa. We see central parts of Southern America, but also a huge part of Northern America. And what's interesting here is that this shows us where people most actively tried to establish a living. We can see it's actually around the coasts. And this is particularly interesting to us when we study colonialism and postcolonialism, because it means that people at the time, they moved to coastal areas to establish themselves, but they rarely went inland. Right? In particular, we can see this when we look at the continent of Africa. So in this case, during these times, about 200 years ago, European countries, as we see here. We have the Ottoman Empire at the top of Africa. We have, there's a few like Portuguese places and so on. The idea then was that people established trade routes, but they didn't have that much of an influence. About 10% of the African continent was taken and belonged at that time then to colonizers. And let's compare it with a map from today. Here we get a very different picture. Well, I should specify, it's not a map from today, but 1945. But the idea here is that it shows us a very different picture. Here we have a list of the colonizing countries that actively took other parts of the world for their own. And perhaps some of you have been asking yourselves at times, like, how come countries' maps sometimes have straight lines like this? You can see it in the North Americas, you can see it in the northern parts of Africa, you can see it in Indonesia down there at the right corner above Australia, that there's like a strangely straight line. And the reason for this is that, well, the colonizing countries essentially decided, this is mine, this is the border. And where people used to live before, where we had countries and we had kingdoms and so on, were split in half. And this is interesting for us to see, to understand the way that it went from a world where there were all of these, a mishmash of different kinds of smaller kingdoms or larger kingdoms, into this where a few, around 7 European countries came to dominate the world. That's why we're now going to be taught about something called the scramble for Africa. As I told you just a few minutes ago, around the 1800s, about 10% of the African landmass was colonized by European countries. Eventually, sometime around 1881 to 1914, there was a rush by European empires to Africa to claim parts of the African country for their own. And this was something that was not very friendly. It was done by force, and the word scramble, to scramble means to hurriedly do something, to rush somewhere, in a rather clumsy and unstructured manner, grasp for something. That's the idea of the scramble here. And during these years then, there was a massive essential invasion of European countries on the African continent to seize these parts of the continent as their own, because they wanted to have the economical possibilities to use natural resources. There were also religious ideas to go and christen the people there for them to be able to be saved. And there were all of these different ideas throughout this time, and I'm going to expand a little bit on this eventually, so please bear with me. And what happened then, if we look at it from a economical perspective, the natives who lived in those parts of the world, they were forced to grow crops that they then sold. Selling a crop that you grow is called a cash crop. And this is different from regularly growing your wheat or your corn or whatever it is to use it as food, because that's what they most certainly did prior to this. They grew and then they used it themselves. But now, when a foreign power came and claimed the land, the natives were forced then to sell their crops, and the money went to the colonizers, not back to the natives themselves. And this was a bloody history. Here there are lots of atrocities. People were put into slavery. There were plenty of cases of horrible bloodbaths that we're not going to cover today, but just For your information, this was not friendly. Eventually, a lot of uprisings occurred. The natives, of course, wanted to reclaim their land and they did not want to be oppressed. But as I mentioned, the colonizing countries, they used deadly force to suppress these situations. Eventually, after the Second World War was over, there began a process known as decolonization. This means that they tried to revert the colonizing process, giving back the lands to the people who originally owned them. But the issue here is that the world map still looks the same today as it did when the colonizing power entered. It didn't go back to the map we saw from the 1800s. It's quite different. So there's still some major effects on an international level. But let's look at what actually happened on a cultural level and for the people who were related to this. So now we're going to look at the actual effects of colonization. And I'm going to focus mainly on three things here. The first one is the way that there was an idea of stereotypes being reinforced and people being seen less as people. This is known as dehumanization. You make someone less of a human. And here many things happened. Number one, the natives were seen as savages, barbarians that didn't have culture or anything, and that they needed to be taught how to live properly. What this is a picture of is an American man carrying these are all stereotypes that we do not agree with of an African man. He's carrying up to, it says, a schoolhouse. So in this case, this image is supposed to represent the way that the white part of the world had to actively carry someone to help them to go to school, to educate them, to stop living in the wilderness and join the civilized part of the world. There's an expression called the white man's burden, that white people are burdened with the idea that they have to help others, to carry them to civilization, to education, and to a better way of life. This leads us to a second idea, that what we call as Eurocentrism, and this means that because people were educated, because people were forced to speak the colonizers' languages, because they were forced to leave their old way of life, eventually the colonized people, the natives in this case, they were forced, and some of them also believed that the European way of life was seen as the norm. This is very interesting because here there was a cognitive change, a mental change, a change in the way of thinking that Europe is what the rest of the world should be like. And there are many such examples. It could be, people learned English. English was seen as the superior language, or French, or German, or many other languages. That's one of them. The other one could be, for example, the way you dress. You have to use European clothing. Or the picture here, which is from an Indian fashion ad, skin bleaching. Whiter skin was seen as the more beautiful option. A fair skin was preferable. And historically, there are many cases around the world where people wanted to have fair skin. We have ancient Asia is such an example. This existed before colonization, absolutely. But it has been in very many ways boosted and enhanced by colonization. So today we see the post-colonial effects where people want to look white. They want to have whiter skin, they want to have bigger eyes, and so on. And then thirdly, what happened here, behind the text, you don't see it because of my screen, it says racism, power abuse, and us versus them. So because of this idea of stereotyping, and you see one way of life the better of the other, racism exploded. So parts of the world was seen as superior to the other. The colonizing countries abused their power because they believed that they had the right. They had to save these people. They had to be the ones who, they had the burden to carry out whatever they needed to do. And we have this us versus them mentality. We are not equal. You belong over there. I belong over here. And we use another word here to express this, which is called otherness. So what that means is that you see someone as the other, the one who is different. You're someone else from who I am. We can never be the same. And this creates a us versus them society. This is still seen today. We have the Black Lives Matters movement. We have an example right here from Stockholm, where still racial segregation, the idea that some people are less equal than others, some people are inferior to others, should be mistreated, can still be seen today in our society. This is something that we can actively, and we can definitely see the traces of it back from in history as well. Excuse me. So colonialism, because of this, has led to all of these post-colonial effects that we can see and we can relate to, and we can definitely see, aha, now I understand why it's the way it is. I'm now going to teach you a few expressions that you're going to use while reading The Color Purple and when dealing with these ideas. And these are also the ones that I expect of you to use when you write your essay. The first one is exoticism. It is the process by which a cultural practice is made stimulating and exciting in its difference from the colonizer's normal perspective. We can see many examples of these in, for example, our media. We have parts of like the Middle East. We have parts of Southern America, the Far East. We have parts of Africa seen as different and magical and mystical and something to be explored. This is when you make something exotic and different. We have an expression that we already covered slightly, which is Eurocentrism. It is the idea that a European or a Western perspective is seen as the norm. For example, the way we view the world and the way culture is formed. We have the expression known as ambivalence. So it is the ambiguous way that colonizers and colonized regard one another. It means essentially that the colonizer, people usually in this case from Western countries, they look down at the indigenous people, see them as inferior, but they could also see them as intriguing and exotic and be like, wow, this is something that we want to partake in. And the same thing happens in the ambivalence and the ambiguous way that the colonized look at the colonizer. So an indigenous person here, a native, might look at the colonizer and say, wow, these people are evil, they're corrupt, they come and take our land, they do all of these horrible things. But they also have the means of education and language that I might want or need to improve my way of life. And since people were, changing their way of thinking, like, oh, the Western way of doing things is the right way, they wanted what the colonizers had. So this is ambivalence. Hybridity is the case where a person has a mix of, for example, cultural, ethnical, and so on, ideas and traditions, in the case where you have a mixed background. And people can feel, in this case, a sense of like a tear in themselves where they, oh, I belong in this part. Maybe I have a parent who is from the colonized part of the world, and then you have a colonizer as a parent as well, and you are like stuck in between two worlds. Mimicry is the way that colonized people, they adapt to the culture of the colonizer. They speak their language, they study their education system, they dress as they do. And this one is also a little bit tricky in the way that people mimic other people's ways, but it also usually includes the idea that if you mimic someone else, you usually still not reach. You don't reach the same level of, let's say, respect and so on as the colonized, because they still, even if you sound English, even if you act and so on, maybe your skin color doesn't allow you to still be accepted like that. Colonial education is the process by which a colonizing country or a power, they assimilate another part of the world into their way of thinking. This is done by schools and by rules and by telling you that our way is better than yours, and this is known then as colonial education. And lastly, we have otherness, which we already slightly covered, but it is the way that a group excludes or marginalizes another group. You become the other from me. We are different. Like that. All right, students, thank you for listening to this lecture. We are going to take a break here, and I hope you have found this interesting. Please send me any questions if you have them, and I will try to answer them as quickly as possible. Have a wonderful day, and see you later. Bye.